So this is part two of a previous video, but I was talking about how I've realized, like Paul, that there are two natures operating within me: the law of God and then the law of sin and death. Right? The law of God being the authority of right and wrong that God Himself has defined, the Torah that was in man before the fall, the Torah that was written down after the fall, and the Torah that the Spirit now teaches in reconciling us to God. God's Torah that has always been consistent is in my mind. It's the good that I want to do. Now, there's another law that my body operates by, that is the law of sin and death. Meaning that, like, my flesh operates by a law that is contrary to the law that my spirit operates by. When I say law, I don't mean it in this like I don't mean it theoretically. I mean it like literally the nature of my flesh as opposed to the nature of the spirit, or the nature of God's instruction. So I find myself sometimes committing sin, but in the back of my mind, it's like I'm in a sunken place, looking at myself doing something that I don't want to do, yet I'm doing it nonetheless, like I'm looking at myself click that video, I'm looking at myself, and sometimes, like, it's me, I'm not gonna lie, sometimes it's me that's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna do that, but there are times, a lot of times, when it's not me. It's like I'm in the back of my mind literally talking to myself like, bro, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? You know that this is not good. You know this is going to hurt you. Why are you continuing? This is the battle. This is the law that my flesh, that my body operates by, where it's literally something in me that is causing me to operate in accordance with a law that I don't agree with. It's like the law is, thou shalt submit to every passion and desire. That's the law of my body. If anything inspires or intrigues or entices, the law of my body is to move towards it. That's why I get the inclination. That's why I get the desire. That is the law that my body, my flesh operates by. As soon as there is enticing, you are to follow it. The law of the Spirit says no. You are to restrain yourself. You are to keep from that. You are to walk away from sin. That is the law. That is the good that I want to do. But my flesh does the evil that I don't want to do. So there's a law of sin and death. The law of my flesh is leading me to sin and death. And then there's a law of the Spirit, the law of God, the Torah, that is the good that I want to do. And so I think this is where some misinterpretation often happens, because I guess maybe because of how Paul is writing here in Romans chapter 7. Oftentimes we think that what Paul is referring to as the law of sin and death is the written Torah that was given to Moses, the Old Testament. We think that he's saying that the Torah that was given to our ancestors is the law of sin and death. But that's not what he's saying here. And he brings that out. I'll continue reading. He brings that out. We'll just read, and it'll come out for itself. It says, for I don't do the good that I want. I'm in chapter 7, verse 19 in Romans. For I don't do the good that I want. Instead, the evil that I don't want is what I do. But if I am doing what the real me doesn't want, it's no longer the real me doing it, but the sin housed inside me. So I find it to be the rule, a kind of perverse Torah, or a perverse law, that although I want to do what is good, evil is right there with me. So you see how he says here, there is a perverse Torah, there is a perverse law that his flesh operates by, that is opposed to the good that he wants to do. So there's two things operating within him here. Now he defines what that law is, what that perverse Torah is. He says, for in my inner self, I completely agree with God's Torah, the same Torah that was given to Moses. But in my various parts, I see a different Torah, one that battles with the Torah in my mind, God's Torah in my mind, and makes me a prisoner of sin's Torah, which is operating in my various parts. So you see here, he's talking about sin's Torah, the Torah, the law of the flesh. He's not talking about the written law that was given to Moses. He's talking about the law of his flesh, the law that says, entice every desire, eat everything you want, do whatever you want, do as thou wilt. That is the law of the flesh. That is opposed to God's law. He's not talking about God's law that was given to Moses. He's talking about the law in his body. Continuing, he says, what a miserable creature I am. Who will rescue me from this body bound for death? Not who will rescue me from Moses' Torah. Not who will rescue me from God's written Torah. Not who will rescue me from Torah at all. Who will rescue me from this body bound to death? So the Torah that he's describing as the law of sin and death here is, again, it's not God's law. It's not Moses' law. It's not even the letter of the law, as we call it, which is like the abuse, like the misunderstanding of the law that the scribes and Pharisees used to oppress people. He's never once saying that there's anything wrong with the Torah that has been given to Moses, with the Torah that which existed before Moses, which exists now. He's saying the law of his body, the law of his flesh, the internal battle and his fleshly desire wanting to commit sin, even though the internal him doesn't want to, is the law of, operates by a law of sin and death. It says, thanks be to God, he will, through Yeshua the Messiah our Lord. To sum up, with my mind, I am a slave of God's Torah. I want to do the right thing. But with my old nature, I am a slave of sin's Torah. With my flesh, I am a slave of the law of sin and death, of the flesh's law, of sin's law that leads to sin and death. And now I think it's important here that he mentions Yeshua, or Christ, and he continues about this in verse 8, because now introduces the law of the Spirit. Because again, this is something else that we distinguish. Before we said that he's talking about he verbalizes three laws here: the law of sin and death, the letter of the law of the Spirit. And I guess we can say the law of God, God's Torah. Now, there's really only two things here. The law of the Spirit, God's Torah, are the same thing. The law of sin and death is one thing, and the letter of the law is a whole other thing. Or I should say, the letter of the law is still God's Torah, but without the Spirit. And we're going to get into that in chapter 8. He says, therefore, there is no longer any condemnation for those who are in union with the Messiah, Yeshua. And I've heard this used. I talked with a friend of mine who was Roman Catholic a long time ago. And this was like when I was very early, in studying. And he brought this to me, and I didn't understand it at the time. And I'm just now starting to get some clarity on it, I think. It says that those who are in union with the Messiah, Yeshua, or Christ, are no longer under any condemnation. People like to use this to say that once you're under Christ, you are no longer bound by Torah. You're no longer bound by the law. What this is actually saying, as we're getting into here, is that once you're in union with Messiah, and now you have, by way of access through the Spirit, you are no longer bound to the law of sin and death in your flesh. Why? Why? Because the Torah of the Spirit, which produces this life in union with the Messiah Yeshua, has set me free from the Torah of sin and death, the Torah of my flesh. For what the Torah could not do by itself, because it lacked the power to make the old nature cooperate, God did by sending his own Son as a human being with a nature like our own sinful one, but without sin. God did this in order to deal with sin, and in doing so, he executed the punishment against sin in human nature, so that the just requirement of Torah might be fulfilled in the just requirement of Torah, still the same Torah, might be fulfilled in us who do not run our lives according to what the old nature wants us to do, but according to what the Spirit wants. And you can reread that for yourself. But I'm going to try to kind of clarify the understanding that I'm getting here. What he's saying is that those who are united with the Messiah now have access to the spirit that is internal, that is now guiding you in Torah, so that you're no longer bound by the law of sin and death in your flesh, because you now have a counselor. You have an internal conviction that if you choose to submit to it and listen to it, you can walk in a nature that is life producing and away from the nature that produces sin and death. What he's saying, that where the written Torah did not have the power to change a person's heart, because they could read it and still just decide, I'm going to do whatever I want. Now, through the Spirit, through Christ, there is now a Spirit that lives inside of you that will convict you and teach you and counsel you, so that if all you have to do is listen, so that in your daily life, when you're away from the Bible, when you're away from the written Torah, when you're away from it, when you're just choosing between if you want 5 burgers or if you want 1, when something convicts you to say, no, 5 burgers will be greedy, that's an internal conviction that exists, that all you now have to do is choose what the Spirit leads you to. In that way, your nature is now going to be in line and aligned with the Torah, God's Torah, rather than your nature being aligned with the Torah of sin and death of your flesh that would want to be greedy and eat those 5 burgers, right? So that's what he's saying here. He's never once here speaking against the law that was given, the Torah that was given to Moses, the Torah that's been established since the beginning of earth, and the Torah that exists now that many try to use his letters to denounce. What he's saying is that there's a law that exists in my body that wants to do as thou wilt, just do anything in my flesh. And there's a law that exists that God has. And now through Yeshua, Yah has given us his Spirit to convict us, so that now all we have to do is submit to the voice of that Spirit, as opposed to the voice of my flesh. Or all I have to do is submit to the law of the Spirit, which is the same law, because God's Spirit is not going to instruct you outside of anything that he has already written in his Torah, anything that was already established. His Torah is going to guide you and convict you to walk in the same law, the same nature, the same Torah that he's already established. It just gives you a better advantage to actually change your nature or walk in a better nature, opposed to what you would believe to be your natural nature. So it goes back to what he was saying about how inside of him there's a part of him that wants to do right, but there's a part of him that is continuing to do wrong, so that even though he wants to do good, he finds himself doing evil nonetheless. Now, through Yeshua, there's a Spirit that, despite your natural inclination to do evil, there's a voice and a conviction that says, no, but this is the right thing to do. And so now all we have to do is listen to that voice. Before, with the written Torah, sin had an advantage, because if you never got to read the written Torah, then you would never have that conscience, relatively, to say, hey, this is the wrong thing to do. It's wrong to eat 5 burgers because that's greedy, as defined by God's Torah. Before, if you never saw the written Torah and you didn't have the Spirit, all you would know, more or less, is what feels natural to you. Not realizing that because you are born into a nature of sin, what is natural to you is actually the law of sin and death. What is natural to you is actually opposition to God and enmity with his Spirit and enmity with his instruction. So the sin took advantage of an opportunity with the written law, whereas anyone who had never seen or heard of the written law could be deceived into committing sin without knowing it. And like we've defined, like we've said, as it says in Scripture, sin is sin regardless of whether or not we know about it. So sin could deceive you by hiding Torah from your knowledge, and allowing you to continue towards sin and death. But now, through Christ, there's a Spirit that takes the same written Torah and puts it inside of you, convicts you from the inside, so that whether or not you read the Torah every single day, there's still a counselor in you to convict you. So this is just the kind of the clarity that I'm finding on the law of sin and death, the law of God and the law of the Spirit. The law of God and the law of the law of the Spirit are the same thing. For the sake of reading, I'm just going to finish out this part that I highlighted, chapter 8, verse 5. For those who identify with their old nature set their minds on the things of the old nature, law of sin and death. But those who identify with the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Having one's mind controlled by the old nature is what? Death. The law of what? Sin and death. Having one's mind controlled by the old nature, not controlled by Moses' law, but controlled by the old nature, is death. But having one's mind controlled by the Spirit is life and shalom. And just for context here, what exactly is life and shalom? Let's go to it in Deuteronomy. I think it's 4. Oh no, Deuteronomy 32 verse 47. Deuteronomy 32 verse 47 says what? Deuteronomy 32 verse 47 says, when he had finished speaking all these words to Israel, he said to them, "Take to heart all the words of my testimony against you today, so that you can use them in charging your children to be careful that they obey all the words of this Torah. For this is not a trivial matter for you. On the contrary, it is your life. Through it you will live long in the land that you are crossing the garden to possess." And I want to pull up another scripture. I don't know if it's in this chapter. I'm going to pull it up real quick. Two options, life and death. In Deuteronomy 30 verse 15, it says, 30 verse 15, it says, "For this mitzvah," or commandment or teaching, "which I am giving you today is not too hard." Well, let me just read from verse 10. Verse 30, verse 10. "However, all this will happen if you pay attention, only if you pay attention to what Yah your God says. Only if you obey his commandments and regulations that are written in the book of the Torah. If you turn to Yahuwah your God with all your heart and all your being. For this mitzvah, which I am giving you today, or commandment, is not too hard for you. It is not beyond your reach. It isn't in the sky so that you need to ask, who will go up into the sky for us and bring it to us to make us hear it so that we can obey it? Likewise, it is not beyond the sea so that you will need to ask, who will cross the sea for us and bring it to us to make us hear it so that we can obey it? On the contrary, the word is very close to you, in your mouth, even in your heart. You can do it. Look, I am presenting you today with, on the one hand, life and good, and on the other hand, death and evil. In that I am ordering you today to love Adonai your God, follow his ways, and to obey his commandments, regulations, and rulings. For if you do, you will live and increase your numbers, and Yah will bless you in the land you are entering, in order to take possession of it. So here again, we see the same concept, the same thing. This is why we always say that Paul knew what he was talking about. Paul knew the Torah. He's not saying anything new. He's not saying anything different. But if you don't read Torah, you're not going to see the consistency in what Paul is saying. 2 occasions here in Torah, it says it classifies Torah as your life. So when he talks about the spirit of the law bringing you life, he's not saying anything different from the same law that was given here to Moses and to Israel. It's the same law, it's the same wording, it's the same themes. On one hand, there's life and shalom and peace. On the other hand, there is sin and death. If you walk in the way of Torah, if you submit to the Spirit and walk in the way of the Spirit, you will have life and shalom and peace. If you walk away from the law, if you walk in the law of your flesh, or the law of sin and death, you will find sin and death. That's all I have for right now.